Thank you, Anna, for that lovely introduction, and also Greg, thank you. I am so excited to be with you all today, and also with everyone online. It is just such a privilege to deliver this opening lecture for such a wonderful program. Now, I know you all heard today about the conceptual foundations, I think it was, you covered in international arbitration today. Is that right? Yes? So come on, I'm going to put you on the spot. Give me some conceptual foundations that you touched upon in your time today. What are the key foundations of arbitration? Anyone? See somebody at the back wanting to say something? Sorry? Consent. What are the other? Yeah, consent, absolutely. What else did you touch upon? Sorry? Party autonomy, absolutely. You get your chance, your flexibility. What else? Confidentiality, spot on. This is great, guys. You were clearly extremely awake during today. Well done. I would say really that if you wanted to explore the sort of conceptual foundations of arbitration, those are the big points that you wanted to hit. Consent, party autonomy, certainly, because that gives you the flexibility that is such a foundation of arbitration, and finally confidentiality. And my take on the concept of arbitration is that basically it is a very good thing. International arbitration is a very good thing because it ticks all those boxes. But it exists in its present form basically because of something that, again, you'll have touched upon today, known as the New York Convention. Everyone heard of that? Good, we're doing well. Now I love this quote. This was once fabulously described by the late Lord Mustill, that I'm sure Greg knew extremely well, but you may not have heard of. And he described the New York Convention as the single most important pillar on which the edifice of international arbitration rests. So he's had some quite fancy language there. But what the New York Convention does is allow awards that are written by arbitrators like me to be enforced pretty much all over the world. So he basically thought, just like I do, that arbitration was a very good thing. I mean, where else can you go and get an award and enforce it globally? Where else can you choose your decision makers? Actually look at somebody's CV and think, are they the right person to hear my dispute? Where else can you choose the procedure, as I mentioned? And where else can you keep it all out of the newspapers? So I would say international arbitration as a concept is really quite brilliant. But you knew the but was coming. I actually think we have squandered some of the opportunities that international arbitration gives us. And going back about 10 years or so, I wrote an article and I called it Visions of the Future. And I was really proud of the article. And it basically was written from the point of view that it was 2030 looking back. And I dug it out when I was preparing for this lecture, and oh my goodness, I must have been having a bad day when I wrote it because it paints such a bleak view of arbitration and ignores all the positives that I've just listed for you. So I quoted all sorts of things in it. I quoted a general counsel saying they only used arbitration because, quotes, the alternatives are so much worse. That was pretty bad. Even for lawyers, I have to say that was pretty pessimistic. I quoted another in-house lawyer. He apparently said no one he knew who uses arbitration regularly was happy with it. So again, it was pretty bleak. And I have to say, lawyers, we do tend to like a lot of hand-wringing. And about 10 years ago in arbitration, there was quite a lot of hand-wringing going on. And it was mainly in relation to things like costs of arbitration. But I will say at the time, we were actually beginning as well to start to wake up to things like the issue of the tremendous lack of diversity in our profession. And again, back in about 2010, I wrote that we had been comfortable with the notion that women were, quotes, a tiny fraction of the arbitration community. And we really were then. I mean, when I crunched the numbers, you were looking at about 5-7% of arbitrators being regularly appointed being women. I mean, it was pretty bad. So, and then on diversity as well, I focused on the underrepresentation of women, but actually in terms of geographic and racial diversity, we were just not even on the radar. There was a tiny acknowledgement of the problem. So I would say that efficiency was on the radar, diversity was starting to be vaguely on the radar, but anything like climate change and certainly our impact on climate change was not mentioned at all, ever. But before I get into the sort of meat of the lecture, I do want to pause and sort of mention something that isn't often talked about. And that's the fact that the New York Convention that I mentioned, this wonderful pillar on which the whole of arbitration is really built, it only came into force in 1958. And it wasn't born with the 170 signatories that it has today. I looked it up, 170 signatories, extraordinary. 10 years after it had been ratified, there were only 30 odd countries that have signed it. And basically it wasn't until right into the late 80s that you were getting any kind of critical mass. Redfern and Hunter, which I'm sure you've all been told to read, and I hope you have read it, it's a wonderful book. That was first published in 1986. May seem a long time ago for you all, but for others of us in the room, that's really not so long ago. And I will tell you that even into the 2000s, there were only about 40 ICSID arbitrations that had happened. So I think it is easy to forget that we are still quite a young industry. And in many ways, we're still finding our way in international arbitration. But I will say again, another but, for what is a relatively young industry, we're actually very bad at embracing any kind of change. And it's a great John F. Kennedy quote where he said, change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past or the present are certain to miss the future. And I very much feel that it's now more than ever that really international arbitration actually does need to turn its eyes very much to the future. And I would say very much in terms of diversity and in terms of sustainability. So I'm going to focus today on what I call my 3 E's in international arbitration. I'm going to talk about efficiency, because that has been something that we have worried about, fretted about for a long, long time. And I think we're getting there, but we're not there yet. I'm going to talk about equality, and I'm going to talk about the environment. And they are 3 very distinct areas. And I would say you can distinguish them in a number of ways, that you can distinguish them at the time we started to think about them in the way I've described it to you, the amount and the quality of attention that they've received. And then the third distinction is the degree to which real progress has been made. And as I would say, we can look at that as we go through it. So that's how you distinguish my 3 E's. They're actually all interestingly united by one common theme, and that is actually the theme of waste. It's waste of time and costs, it's waste of talent, and it's waste of resources. So let's start on efficiency. And I'm going to sort of skip over a little bit of efficiency, but it's something you need to know about and you need to be thinking about as you go into your international arbitration careers. As I say, we have fretted about time and costs really since I started practicing all the way back in the 90s. Back in 1989, it's Lord Mustell again. You can tell I was quite a big fan of his. He said, are arbitration proceedings any longer imbued by informality, or do they not have all the elephantine laboriousness of an action in court? Again, he had some quite good language, but you know what he was getting at. He was saying international arbitration is too much like court proceedings. We are losing that ability to be flexible. And that is the key advantage, one of the key advantages that arbitration has. That said, international arbitration nowadays, I would say, does follow a fairly similar trajectory. We aren't exploiting that ability to be flexible, to adapt the proceedings to the dispute before us. We tend to have very lengthy submissions, extensive witness statements, generally in-person hearings, that is changing a little bit, and vast quantities of documentary evidence. So I think if we want to really address time and costs, we need to go back to our foundation of flexibility. And that will help us move to an international arbitration process that's more fit for the future. And so I would say that, in fact, contrary to what I've been saying about the other two, to address efficiency, we probably need to look back to our original roots before we started to get more like court proceedings. But as I say, to address equality in the environment, that's where we need to be looking forward. Now, I mentioned waste as a common theme underpinning my 3 E's. And by not promoting inclusive behaviour and opening doors to diverse candidates, we run the risk, as I say, of wasting the talent that we have available to us. And similarly, efforts to address climate change also very much focus on eliminating waste. And research has shown that adopting more sustainable practices can reduce costs and increase the efficiency of the process. So they're all linked together. We mustn't waste the opportunity to contribute to the climate change conversation. And we must seize the chance to influence laws and policies across the globe to promote sustainable behaviours. And then there's also the very compelling argument that if we achieve greater diversity, we will actually drive more creative efforts, and that will help us rise to the challenge of addressing climate change. But again, another but, this change isn't going to be easy. All of us involved in the conduct of international arbitration are a fairly conservative group. We know that. Change does not come naturally to most of us because we're deeply ingrained lawyers and we don't do change. And achieving widespread behavioral change in any situation is challenging. I would say international arbitration has evolved in a fairly passive way. Arbitrators tend to sit back, operate on the basis that it's the parties' process. We don't want to be seen to be overly controlling proceedings. We don't want to be seen to be imposing our will on the parties. So arbitration per se isn't a good candidate for the very extensive and I would say radical change that we actually need. I'm pausing just a little bit on behavioral change. It's a theory known as reasoned action. And this apparently says that behaviors occur because of intention, obviously. Intention is influenced by personal attitude and social norms. The more positive a person's attitude is towards change, the more others are doing the change, then the more likely is to change is to occur. And that's why us coming together to have these conversations about these fairly challenging issues is really important. And I would say that it's right here that leadership really comes in to play. And I don't think we talk enough about leadership in arbitration, again, because of our tendency to sit back and be fairly passive. So if we can go out and we can amplify those voices that are already talking about the behavioral change we need, that will help us achieve that lasting change. And I would say empowering arbitrators in particular, I've been thinking a lot about this recently, empowering arbitrators to take greater ownership of the disputes before them will be a real opportunity to shape the future of international arbitration. And that will only be achieved by very bold leadership from those who are at the top of the profession. And I would say people like you who are starting out, driving the change from beneath as well. So that's where I see those key players for the change that we need. But let me pause and just drill down a little bit on the problems that face us in terms of equality and climate change before we can talk, I hope, about some possible solutions. So equality. Now, by any measure, international arbitration is not diverse. I am not going to bore you with statistics today. I'm sure you've heard them many times before. But I mean, suffice to say that now only around 25% of arbitral appointments are going to women, which is significantly better than where we were 15 years ago, but is still not where we want to be necessarily. And we are still way, way behind in terms of ethnic and geographic diversity. And things are improving. They really are, but I do still feel that arbitration tribunals in particular, and law firms, counsel to perhaps a lesser extent, aren't properly reflective of the people that they're appearing before them and the clients sitting behind those people. Counsel, I would say, are almost invariably men, particularly when it comes to first chairs. That's what I see an awful lot. And I know there are efforts being made to change that. And as I say, in terms of ethnic, geographic, age and socioeconomic factors, I think the situation is extremely challenging indeed. And the bottom line is that people who don't fit the middle-aged Anglo-European male model are less likely to be appointed than people who do. That's a fact. That said, I always say this, I readily admit that I benefited from Anglo-European privilege in the past, because my 10 years that I spent living and working in Houston, Texas, my English accent, the more Downton Abbey, the better, got me an awful long way when it came to impressing clients and so on. So privilege, it can work in all sorts of different ways. But let me pause on why we should care about diversity. And I'm sure you are all familiar with this, but the research is so clear and so compelling that diverse groups produce better outcomes. Diversity generates strength in decisions and flexibility and creativity in approach. And you know this, when you look around the teams that you work in every day, you know it, that it's the diverse teams that come up with better ideas when they are composed of different people in different locations with different backgrounds. And although it may seem a little bit more challenging to work with different people, having different approaches and different experiences means that you will get a better result. Now, I want to pause a little bit on something that's often mentioned in terms of age diversity, because I think this is an important point. The barriers to entry to practice international arbitration are very high. We know that. You all know that in your careers starting out. And there is a reason why arbitrators tend to be of a certain age, and that sometimes gets lost in these conversations. So I want to just bring it out a little bit, because a lot of what arbitrators do is about exercising discretion and, to state the obvious, judgment. And in order to have the ability to exercise discretion well, you need to have a vast amount of experience. And people appearing before you need to know that you have that level of experience, to have the confidence to know that you have that judgment. And that's often forgotten. And it ties back to the flexibility point, because we are not constrained by vast numbers of court rules and things. Then we do have a very broad discretion. And those who appoint us need to be very confident that we are going to exercise that discretion well. And so that comes back to the lawyers being conservative point, because it isn't any wonder that because you're entrusting your tribunal with such a broad discretion, you're going to be very conservative when it comes to choosing them. This is a double whammy, if you like. So that said, we can obviously challenge the status quo. I think we have very successfully in the last 5 years, certainly on diversity. But the way we do that is by challenging our implicit biases. And I was stunned by this research when I came upon it a few years ago. Research has shown that we react differently to babies, 3-month-old babies, if we know their sex, which I found absolutely astonishing. And then if you go take a child a little bit older, from the time they're walking, they're given different toys, different clothes, and different opportunities. And most importantly, they are given different messages. And there's absolutely no difference in girls' brains or boys' brains. There's a very small difference can be found in adult brains. And the reason for that is the different ways that boys and girls are socialized and back to those messages that they receive. So that's quite sobering. But we all react to men and women differently as well. And you may have heard these examples, but I'm going to give you a couple of them. There was one study where journal articles were rated lower by both male and female, very importantly, male and female reviewers when they were told the author was a woman. There was a study of postdoctoral fellowships which showed that female students needed substantially more publications to achieve the same rating as the male students. In evaluating the professors, reviewers were 4 times more likely to ask for supporting evidence about the female professor, such as, can they see her teach, or some kind of proof that she got there on her own merit, than they were for the male professor. And there are countless other studies which show this, and we all do it. That's the thing. When I was counsel in international arbitration, I used to say I am just as unlikely to appoint a female arbitrator as my male colleague, because it comes back to how our brains are wired. Now, the arbitration community has very much swung into action on diversity and has forced us to challenge these implicit biases. And really, I think it is an incredibly exciting time to be an international arbitration practitioner, particularly if you're an atypical arbitration practitioner. You've probably heard of the various initiatives, but I do want to touch upon them, 2 of them in particular that I think have been absolutely key. So the first one is the Equal Representation in Arbitration Pledge, which addresses the underrepresentation of women. I've been a proud member of the steering committee there since its inception, and we've just had our 5,000th signatory, but the change that has made has been astonishing. And then REAL is the other unbelievably successful organization, which is Racial Equality for Arbitration Lawyers. And again, I'm extremely proud ambassador for that organization, because they are doing amazing work for all sorts of underrepresented groups that really haven't had a voice in the arbitration community yet. I occasionally wonder whether a little bit of diversity fatigue is setting in because of this, perhaps not because of the success of the initiatives, but there's a certain amount of, well, the pledge has done so well. Are we all, home and dry on diversity? We are so not there. And we have to all be very alert to the risk of diversity fatigue. The research is so compelling that diverse groups do better. I touched upon it, but before I leave the topic of diversity, I want to focus on my favorite study that you may or may not have come across, but it plays to my liking of murder mysteries as well, this study, because it's a Columbia Business School study, and it looked at the effect of having diverse teams, as I say. And what happened was that the teams were split into groups of 4, and it was either 4 close friends or 3 good friends and a stranger, an outsider. And they were given this murder mystery to solve, but it was pretty complicated stuff. They had to look at witness statements, alibis, they had to look at the forensics. It's pretty full on. I mean, I would have quite enjoyed being on that study. But what was really interesting, let me get to the point. The teams, would be surprised, the teams with the stranger in got the right answer 75% of time versus 54% with the homogenous team. So pretty significant. But what was very interesting, and I often talk about this, is that the participants had a very different feel for the task. So the diverse teams found it really, really hard work. It was cognitively incredibly demanding for them because they were arguing, they were having different perspectives being talked about. They got to the right decision, but they weren't really sure that it was absolutely the right decision. But they got there, and as I say, they significantly outperformed the homogenous groups. But the homogenous teams sat there and found it all very lovely experience, as you'd expect. They spent the whole time being a little echo chamber and telling each other how wonderful they were and how right they all were. And even though they were much, much more likely to get it wrong, they were much more confident about getting it right. And the conclusion was, with the homogenous groups, they were more likely to form judgments that, quotes, combined excessive confidence with grave error. And I just wonder if that sounds familiar to any of you, because it certainly chimed with me, I can tell you. So I have to move on from diversity. It's a topic very close to my heart, but bottom line is we have to remain committed to real change in this area. And on a positive note, it is astonishing where we've got to from where we were, and there's so much more we can achieve. I'm very confident of that. Let me turn to my final E, the environment. And this is where we simply do not have 10 years to bed in the change that we need. We have to change right now. And my one regret about launching the campaign for greener arbitrations in 2019 is that I didn't launch it in 2009 or even before then. And it is a big regret because, as I say, time is running out. And talking about time, you may all know this, but apparently, if the time since the universe began is compressed into one 24-hour period, humans only appear in the last 4 seconds. But in the last few milliseconds of those 4 seconds, our impact has been absolutely immense, and we have changed the climate on our planet. And in the same way that years ago, you had a canary at the entrance to a coal mine who would let you know when the coal mine was in danger, melting sea ice and extreme weather events tell us that climate change has happened. But regrettably, in the international arbitration community, we have been very slow, I think, to notice that the canary is dead. And I quote Wendy Miles QC quite often on this, because this was a speech she gave a few years ago, and she said very politely, in a very restrained way, in the years in which I've been involved in climate change issues, she said, it has struck me how few members of our international law community are fully informed and engaged. For curious and clever people, I find that unusual. And as I would say, that was very polite and very restrained, and that is the way Wendy is. She said it was unusual. I would say that it is unacceptable that as an international law community, we have not been more engaged on climate change. Because frankly, even when we're confronted by a climate emergency on an enormous scale, we continue to behave as if it's someone else's problem. And I'm here today to tell you that it isn't. I do include myself in all this. I mentioned I spent 10 years living and working in Texas with my Downton Abbey accent. And on a clear day in Houston, you know, I could see the refineries out on the Gulf Coast. I could see nodding donkeys when I came back in from a weekend away. I drove 30 miles to and from work every day. I filled up my minivan with gas at $3 a gallon. You know, all my clients were energy companies. All my work was hydrocarbon based. And I saw my clients evolve. I saw them start talking about ESG, environmental, social, and governance principles. I didn't take much notice. I was reasonably environmentally conscious in my personal life. My professional life, I just thought it was somebody else's problem. So in relation to addressing climate change, Greta Thunberg says all we have to do is wake up and change. So easy. But for me, I did wake up and change, or try to change, back in 2018 when I was chairing a big energy arbitration in Houston. And at the end of the 2-week hearing, I looked behind me and saw this wall of printed bundles. I realized we hadn't opened one during the whole of the 2-week hearing. We had got electronic bundles, but we had said we would have printed bundles in case the technology failed. And that's not good enough. We need to have the confidence that we have that the technology will work. And if it doesn't work, that's not a big deal. It'll go down for 10 minutes. It's not a problem. The other realization I had, apart from this wall of printed bundles, was chatting with colleagues. And I often say this, you know, as an industry, we had flight pride. We would talk about how we would jump on a plane at the drop of a hat. We didn't have flight shame or flygskam, as Greta Thunberg calls it, and it sounds much better in the Swedish. But we had flight pride, and we really, really shouldn't. And when we talk about things like the devastation of Easter Island from the Easter Island statues, we say, why didn't they look around? Why didn't they realize what they're doing? Why didn't they stop before it was too late? And I do sometimes ask myself, will arbitration practitioners still be proud of their travel schedules in years to come? And I am worried that as the pandemic recedes, we will just all go back to the way we were, and we can't. And the reason we can't is that back to 1958 in that famous New York Convention, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in 1958 was 316 parts per million. 1998, which was when I did my first international arbitration, it was 367. Right now, today, it is 420. And it is not up for debate that we have to get back to at least 1990 CO2 levels to avoid catastrophic climate change. But if we carry on running our practices as if we're still in the 1990s, we are going to be part of the problem. And frankly, it is time now for all of us to step up as leaders and actually be part of the solution. So we have been out of touch on climate change and the impact it's having on and will have on our practices, and more importantly, the impact we are having on it, and it has to change. Climate change has happened. The canary, as I say, is dead. It's up to us to work out how we all, as a community, get out of the mine. So we do have to act now. We have to act now to minimize our contributions to the emergency by reducing the carbon footprint of our practices, but also to maximize our contributions to the efforts to address the emergency through law and policy. And I always think of this as tackling climate change on two levels as lawyers. You tackle it at the macro level, the policy level, and at the micro level, the practice level. I'm pausing very briefly on the macro level, and this is where you all are going to see this impact on your practices as you go through your careers. Climate change is going to have a huge impact on arbitration practitioners. We will need to be up the learning curve in terms of the impact of regulatory change that are underway, the flow of capital through the system as the world transitions, we hope, to net zero. And clients will expect this of all of you. They are putting ESG principles at the front and center of their businesses. There's a UN report that found that 91% of global CEOs viewed climate change as an urgent priority for business. And I just wonder what the other 9% were doing. So there are huge opportunities for lawyers in terms of contributing to the fight against climate change at that macro level. But my focus, very much smaller, has been on the micro level. And I would say that here, ESG principles are equally important. I do believe that just as we are now starting to see law firms looking at clients looking at law firms' teams through a diversity lens and requiring law firms to field diverse teams, I think they are going to start looking at law firms through an ESG lens as well, and particularly asking law firms what they're doing in this space. Now, I'm going to pause for a minute because you might all be sitting there, really, Lucy, does this all really matter, the micro stuff? You know, we want to do the big picture, law, policy, we want to change the world. Does it really matter if I print some bundles? Come on, Lucy, it's not a big deal. So I would say to you, yes, it really does matter. Back when we launched the campaign in 2019, I knew I was going to be dealing with some cynical lawyers. And so we did a fairly extensive environmental impact assessment of international arbitration. We drafted a case study and crunched all the numbers. And we found, you may have seen this headline figure before, we found that 20,000 trees would be needed to offset the carbon emissions from one major international arbitration. And that's around 400 tons of carbon equivalent. And put that in context for all of you, that's pretty much all of the trees in Central Park. That's one arbitration, and over 90% of the emissions from that one major arbitration. And it was a major case that we looked at, but not dissimilar to the cases that you will, I hope, be working on in the future. 90% of the emissions related to air travel. So I would ask everyone to take a really critical look at their practices and see where they can make changes, because there are big changes like flying less, but there are also small changes. And I often talk about the one very small change that you can make, which is disposable coffee cups. Because when we looked at that major arbitration, we looked at all the usual things that you would expect. We looked at printing, we looked at couriers, we looked at flights, hotel rooms, and we looked at coffee cups. And we found that if you extrapolated the coffee in that one major arbitration, that we worked out that around 3,000 disposable coffee cups were used. And that equates to more than a ton of carbon equivalent emissions. So we may all drink a lot of coffee, but a little change can be use the disposable cup. Sorry, you ditch the disposable cup, use a reusable cup, because it sends a very important message. But the real big change is flying. And the average carbon footprint per person in the UK is 12 tons. One return flight from London to Houston business class is 7 tons of carbon equivalent emissions. And to have the best chance of avoiding a 2% rise in global temperatures, the average global carbon footprint needs to drop to under 2 tons. So these are big, big changes that we need to make. And right now, as a community, I'm pretty convinced that we can't just all go back to in-person hearings. I entirely accept that in certain situations, they are preferable, but we need to be leading on this, and we need to be cutting down the flights we take across the board. We need to be challenging colleagues on their choices, and we need to be questioning the message that we're sending. And it will all make a difference. I promise you that. We reran those numbers from that case study, and we reran them in what we call a greener way. And it wasn't even that green, because remember, this all predated the pandemic. So we actually just reduced a flight at every stage of the arbitration. We got rid of the printed bundles. We factored in the carbon emissions of hosting an electronic platform. And by making those changes, making it slightly greener, we reduced the emissions by 50 tons of carbon equivalent. And incidentally, we reduced disbursement costs by 40%. So it's quite clear that it's not just a strong moral case for arbitrating in a more sustainable way. There's actually quite a strong business argument as well. Now, the change that we've all experienced as a result of the pandemic has been the biggest change in international arbitration, certainly I've ever seen in my 25 years of practice. But the point I want to make with regard to that is that we didn't just talk, we didn't endlessly debate it. And in the arbitration community, we're very good at talking. We're not quite so good at doing. And I think the pandemic really showed us what we could do in terms of radical change quickly, because I don't think we have any alternative now. And it's easy to think that a very small change, back to that reusable cup I mentioned, that it won't make a difference, but that underestimates the power of collective action. And collective action starts with leadership. And there's a great saying, it's a bit twee, but it's still a good saying. A leader is one who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way. And the campaign for greener arbitrations can really help you all with the knowing point. Okay, go to the website, download the various green protocols that I will talk a little bit more about, and you have everything you need to run your arbitration in a more sustainable way. So we can do the knowing bit for you, but the going and the showing is up to all of you. So to sum up in relation to climate action, I think there's a few things what I would like to see. I would like to see us flying less, thinking more, talking less, and doing more, because we know what we have to do, but now we really need to make sure that we are doing it. And very importantly, we are being seen to do it. I don't want us, when I say talk less and do more, as I say, we are a community that talks. I'm standing here talking to you tonight, but we haven't got the time to spend time debating these things. We can't spend the time talking about whether a high value arbitration has a higher carbon footprint than a lower one and all these things. We don't have the luxury of that time. You don't need me to tell you. Maybe you do if you haven't done that much arbitration, but anyone that has been involved in international arbitration doesn't need me to tell them how wasteful arbitration can be. I can talk about data and statistics. I can talk about the tons of carbon that each arbitration emits, and I have done this evening. I can talk about long haul flights, mountains of bundles, unnecessary travel. I can talk about all that, but I think we all knew deep down how wasteful we were. And I go back to my primary point, which is we all thought somebody else would solve the problem. And it's the great Barack Obama quote that you would have heard when he went to COP26 last November. He said, "We are the first generation to feel the effect of climate change and the last generation who can do something about it." So it's a bit of a sobering quote, but it is our problem, and we absolutely have to be part of the solution. And really everything that I have talked about today comes down to behavioral change. And the big question in relation to behavioral change is always whether it will last. And I have to say this, but women have led the various initiatives that have set the tone for international arbitration over the last 5 years. We took the fact that, as we said, people were comfortable with the notion that women were a tiny fraction of international arbitrators, and we made it really uncomfortable for people to maintain that status quo. And I think when we're talking about these big issues, we can take real inspiration from the changes that we've achieved in relation to the underrepresentation of women, certainly in relation to the underrepresentation of white women. But I do think now is the time to really push hard again for more diversity, greater intersectionality, and to encourage a more sophisticated approach to other issues, such as socioeconomic diversity that is very rarely talked about. And because, as I say, with greater diversity comes greater creativity, and we need to be more creative in the way we approach our practices. Arbitration is flexible, I keep saying that. We have to use that flexibility, not just give it lip service. We have to use that flexibility to craft the process to the dispute, always looking for efficiency, but getting that efficiency through a lens which factors in environmental and social considerations. But as I say, it is our approach to climate issues that worries me, and I worry that we will not make the radical changes that we need. We need urgent and we need coordinated action by everyone involved in arbitration. And as I say, there are big obstacles to achieving that. The obstacles are things like present bias. People worry about the now. People understandably think climate change is less pressing than the issue than the pandemic, the cost of living crisis that everyone is facing. Again, if you don't necessarily see the impacts of climate change, you're not going to be concerned by them. If you don't get positive feedback, and this is where we can all help, you don't get positive feedback for people who are trying to make changes, you're less likely to make them. You might have heard of a book called Nudge. I don't know if anyone's heard of that book. It's a really great book. If you haven't, it's just come out with a new edition. It's about behavioral change, essentially, and talking about how people can be sort of nudged towards action rather than forced towards it. So, for example, if you do something like if you put fruit at an eye level in the supermarket, that's a nudge towards better behavior, whereas banning junk food is forcing people to do certain things. And I think here is where we should really be thinking about how we nudge people to behave differently in our community. We do have to wake up, we do have to act, but we do need that nudge. And there's a couple of rules of nudge that I want to touch upon before I conclude. The first rule of a successful nudge is to make it easy for people to change. And going back to the campaign for greener arbitration, we have made it easy for you. I mentioned the green protocols. They are detailed directives, detailed guidelines that tell every player in an international arbitration what they can do to arbitrate in the same way, but with less carbon impact. So they focus primarily on 3 critical areas, not rocket science: clean forms of energy, reduce or eliminate long-haul travel. I've talked a lot about that tonight. Minimize waste, for example, by eliminating hard copy filings. So that's it's easy to make those changes. Go to the protocols, download them, follow them. And the second rule of the nudge is slightly harder, but it's to make it a default position. And this is where I think the travel issue is going to really be a problem, because I think the default for hearings should be, if not entirely remote, it should certainly have a hybrid element, and it should certainly trigger a conversation about the right way to hold the hearing, taking into account all the issues plus the carbon footprint, which we've never properly done. So where we have to travel, we need to be thinking green. And I will leave you with the statistic, which is that a virtual hearing has 19 times less impact on the environment than an in-person hearing. That's recent research by Herbert Smith Freehills, which is pretty compelling. So if we could get to the stage when we made it a default that we don't travel, it means that when we do travel, we're making a conscious, informed decision to do so. And that's going to be very significant. So I do believe that my 3 E's that I've talked about this evening, efficiency, equality, and the environment, are deeply intertwined. But it's really only when we stop and we embed these social environmental considerations into every international arbitration. It's only when we do that that we'll finally get away from good old Lord Mustall's elephantine laboriousness of international arbitration. And we'll move to an international arbitration process that is streamlined, nimble, and fit for the future. Thank you very much.